ancient astronaut or ancient alien series that was mostly hosted by Giorgio Tsoukalos, which he's been on my show before, and he's coming back again in the near future in October to discuss Eric's newest book about extraterrestrial. And I'm having trouble pronouncing it. I don't have it in front of me, but it has to do with ancient aliens and the return of the gods in the Mayan calendar of 2012. I'm pretty sure you know the book I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. I do.
And I really should have had that in front of me, but I wasn't aware I was going to read that. And I got to tell you, I think you looked a little different on that show than you look in the picture I'm looking at now that I got from you online.
I need new photographs on my website. Is the short answer. My hair has been growing, yes.
Which would be why I may not have recognized you right away. But I got to tell you, ancient aliens, that's a favorite topic of mine. But one of the things that drew my interest to you more than anything else, it stuck out, this was like 2 years ago, was when I read that article on your site about the metal library, because, I mean, that just smacked me as being very, very close, or, you know, real close to the other Hall of Records that Edgar Casey mentioned could be in the possible Yucatan. And I don't think the area you're talking about those are in is very far from that, is it?
Well, it to some extent is, because obviously the Yucatan is in Mexico and the Metal Library of San Hall is in Ecuador. So we're definitely still talking about several thousands of miles from each other. But when you're looking at like the contents of what Casey was talking about, and the idea that certain knowledge is being held in caves for us, and that this is at some point for us there to discover, then yes, there is quite a bit of correspondence between the Edgar Casey stories and the Metal Library.
Well, I got to tell you, you caught me red-handed. I'm not real good with geography.
You're Mr. Paranormal, you're not Mr. Geography.
There you go. But I got to tell you, it was still a very fascinating story, and I was wondering if you could, kind of brief my guests a little bit on what you know about that, because as far as I know from the time I read it, that could have been updated by now, couldn't it?
Well, what happened is this, that to give a very long story sometime, the Metal Library came about in the 1960s when a guy called Juan Moritz, who was a Hungarian expat, was staying in Ecuador, and he heard stories from the locals about the existence of this cave, the Cave of the Tiles, which was supposed to contain the Metal Library. And the Metal Library was said to be the long-lost treasure of a lost civilization, sometimes linked with King Atahualpa of the Incas, sometimes dating back even further. And he made contact with Eric von Däniken, who at that time had just published his book Chariots of the Gods. And so Eric came over, I think, in the early 1970s, and Moritz was a bit taken aback because Eric wanted to see for himself rather than just hear Moritz talk. And we now know that Moritz ran into a problem there, because Moritz was just reporting stories he had heard. He had never been inside. He didn't even really know where it was. So Moritz panicked and showed Eric von Däniken just a cave, anyone, and said that, oh, well, beyond this point, that's kind of like where the Metal Library is. Von Däniken wrote about it, and then because it was such a spectacular book, von Däniken was put to the test, and Moritz, under pressure, said that actually he hadn't shown von Däniken the Metal Library. And the entire issue became extremely controversial, and von Däniken to this day believes that all of the negative publicity involving it actually cracked some of his reputation. Now what happened from that point onwards is that a Scottish engineer of the name of Stan Hall became interested, and in 1976 he organized an expedition using the Ecuadorian and the British armies and obviously governments to help him out into trying to find out where the supposed Metal Library was. And he went into what had been identified as the Tiles Cave. Now, it was a very interesting expedition. Scientists found so many new things, but from an archaeological or treasure point of view, nothing really was found. Stan stayed in Ecuador for up until the late 1990s. And in that period of time, he began to retrace how Moritz was telling the story. Where did he hear it from? which kind of like, were the people who might have known about this. And he identified one for one the main players of this saga. And he realized that the story actually originated with a person called Petronio Camarillo. And he realized that once he had contacted Petronio, then that we would be very close to discovering what it was. And then him and Petronio said that they should do an expedition to this cave. And unfortunately, when they were preparing this, Petronio was murdered in the streets in 1997, and so Stan was left to fend for it for himself. I knew Stan from roughly the early 21st century onwards, and unfortunately 2 years ago, in fact to this day, today 2 years ago, Stan Hall died of cancer. So I knew Stan very late in life, and the legacy of the Taos Cave, and specifically trying to go to the place which Petronio had identified as a real Taos Cave, is now actually left to Stan's family, and specifically his eldest daughter has gone to Ecuador, to spend several years, if not the remainder of her life there, to dedicate her life and her time in trying to find out where the caves are. So, yes, since the time of me writing that article some years ago, the story could have progressed, but personal circumstances involving Stan's health basically mean that that hasn't happened.
So there's nothing really stopping anybody from going back to investigate it now, though, is there?
The only thing which is stopping people, some people have tried. Some people have gone there. To some extent, what you have to realize is that this is a treasure site. People knew what they were doing. So Petronio described it as such. Well, it's not like going into just any show cave, whether in America, South Africa, or wherever you want to go to one of these. This is a cave which was protected by people. And so what Petronio had to do to get in was actually dive in a river where there is an opening in the rocks, and then when you have done that, you can surface into the interior structure of this cave system. So is something stopping you? Yes, there is. There is a stream, sometimes with a tremendous amount of current in there. So there's also the assumption that somewhere in the nearby mountains there is probably another entrance which might have been blocked off. Nobody has really ever identified the secondary entrance, which likely was used and therefore probably was blocked off. So if something's stopping you, if you're a Superman and if you are extremely well organized and you have the right equipment and the right people, then nothing is stopping you. To do an expedition in Ecuador is not as easy as it might seem, and it was actually Stan's prediction that really the cave would only be open if once again Ecuador had a different kind of regime in place. He felt that the current democratic regime really was pretty useless in trying to organize themselves into anything of coherence, and that this would by default make it impossible for anybody to successfully open the caves.
So these metal books will probably never see the light of day.
I think given time, they have been there for at least 500 years, maybe thousands of years. So I think to open them, it might be sooner than we think. I think when we look at the world as we speak, some of these governments and the way they're doing things are in for a shock, and we are all in for some political change in the near future. So I wouldn't say that we're going to have to wait centuries for this to happen. It's possible, but it could also be a matter of a decade or so.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because the other Hall of Records that we're pretty certain were pretty close to in Egypt under the SZIENCE, I understand that we're not exactly allowed to go down into there and investigate it any real extent too. Is my understanding correct? Do you know?
Yes, I mean there are several places. I mean, if you want, I can come back to the story of the Yucatan. But in Egypt, it is clear that the powers that are are making sure that Zahi Hawass remains in power and rules supreme over the Giza plateaus of ancient Egypt as a whole. And that is something which, I have written about and which goes beyond the laws of the country. Hawass is in a unique position whereby at the age of 60 he was supposed to have retired. There is a special dispensation of the Egyptian government, if not the president, which allows you to stay beyond that period of time for another 3 years. That was granted. And in May or June of this year, he was supposed to have resigned his position as head of the Egyptian Council of Supreme Antiquities. And that hasn't happened. He is basically going to rule for as long as he can and for as long as his health permits. And for a 63-year-old man, for those of you who have been able to see Chasing Mummies on the History Channel, those people know that he, for a 63-year-old man, he's extremely healthy. And he rules and he makes sure that nobody else is allowed to do anything. And this isn't just on the Egypt plateau, on the Giza plateau. This is across Egypt. In the documentary Chasing Mummies, you see how he confronts an Italian researcher, I believe, Kathleen Martinez, if I'm not mistaken. Well, she's not Italian, but Kathleen Martinez is doing research in Alexandria, and she is interested in trying to identify where Cleopatra and Mark Antony might have been buried, and she has done a tremendous research. And just from the very few minutes which you see on the show, you can tell that this woman is on the track of something and is about to make a major discovery. And when she tries to tell Zahi Hawass as to how she has arrived at these conclusions, he basically says, I do not want to hear what you're saying. I am convinced that these tombs are somewhere, I think, in the East Harbor underwater, and I don't care what you say. And when it comes to the Giza Plateau, Mr. Hawass is even more opinionated than when it comes to the tomb of Cleopatra. So he rules over there, and anything which happens on the Giza Plateau, as was in evidence with recent discoveries by British researcher Andy Collins, is basically pushed to the side or interpreted in a way that the old status quo as to what ancient Egypt is all about remains intact.
Well, you got to give him credit where it's due. He's definitely good at what he does.
Dictators usually are.
Good point. Now, folks, you can learn more about Philip and all his material. He's got many articles on his website, www.philipcoppens.com. And it's not just about Egypt or about the Metal Library in Ecuador. He's got articles about the Da Vinci Code, about Templars, and pretty much finds all across America, many places around the world, actually. And, I'm thinking you probably traveled more than most people have during your lifetime, haven't you, Philip?
I probably have, yes. I won't say that I'm the most traveled. I definitely know people like David Childress and various others who travel far more than I do. But yes, I definitely travel more than the average person.
Now, I was reading your article about the Da Vinci Code the other day. Not the Da Vinci Code, I'm sorry, but Angels and Demons. Well, actually, I think it started out about the Da Vinci Code and turned into Angels and Demons.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I noticed, I come across during reading that, was that you had made the same observation that I had made, that while Dan Brown, during the course of the book, was trailing after the Illuminati and was being led on a breadcrumb trail after them, at the actual end of the book, we come to find out that it was not the Illuminati after all, which I don't know how many people that read the book really noticed this. What you didn't make a note of, that maybe you, I think, depended on your readers to note, was that not only was it not the Illuminati in the end, but that it was actually the Pope at the Vatican that was the source of all the trouble to begin with, that was, leaving the breadcrumb trail to make it look like the Illuminati.
Yes, I mean, the writing articles about fiction is extremely difficult because at the same time you want to illuminate or illustrate and add to the novel. At the same time, you don't want to give away too much of the plot. So there was kind of like one of the issues there that the central plot line I quite often try as much as I can to keep out of my articles.
Yeah, okay. Well, I did notice that it was interesting that it came back to the Vatican, because I've done a lot of study on the internet and watched a lot of documentaries and read a lot of books, and I've talked to people like Tim Murphy and Hugh Montgomery and some others that, have done a lot of work in this area. And, there's reason to believe that actually Dan Brown might have been onto something there, even though he was writing it in a fictional format.
Well, I mean, one of the great things I find about Angels and Demons is that a few years ago, when Pope John Paul II died, they actually all the guidance reporters in Vatican Square used Angels and Demons as their guidebook as to what was going to happen next in the election of the new Pope. So, it underlines that Dan Brown does do his research and sometimes does it very well. At the same time, he is a fiction writer, and the fact that he opens with a one-pager of saying these are the facts, I think has thrown off a lot of people on the wrong trail. When he says like fact this, fact that, does he believe those facts? Probably he does, but at the same time, I think what is important is that he's referring to the fact that his facts have been made by other people in non-fiction, so that he's not just inventing these things, that he's not inventing things like the Priory of Zion. It's that it is a fact that other people have written about the Priory of Zion in a non-fictional setting. So I think he plays that edge of fiction and fact very well, and obviously in a way that is appealing to the masses.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. And he really astonished me in The Lost Symbol, because I had never once, and I'm an American, knew that at the Capitol on the rotunda in the ceiling there was that apotheosis of George Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that is the case, that every town or city or country he touches, he opens up to the reader and sometimes to the television audience, the film industry, in a new light, in a new perspective. And I think that's another aspect of the Dan Brown phenomenon. You can go to Rome, you can go to Paris, and have Dan Brown tours now, which basically take in sites which are mentioned in his book. And I think it's fabulous that people get to see different sides to these capitals and a more esoteric.
Yeah, I think it's a very good way to learn a lot as well. And I want to ask you, while you're talking about books, why don't you tell us what the titles of your books are, and if you can, maybe give us a summary of them.
Well, I have written 5 books. One of the books is the most recent one is Servants of the Grail, which is about the Grail as such. And what I try to make the point in the book is that whereas other people have been writing about the Grail in very wide, non-specific areas, actually when you look at Wolfram van Assenbach's Grail story, we're confronted with the most interesting account, but also with an account which actually shows you where to look. And a German person called André de Mandak has basically identified the characters of the Grail legend as historical people. So the Grail is not fiction, the Grail is actually a family account. And in Servants of the Grail, with de Mandak's help, I identify basically who this Grail family is and where the Grail castle was located. My other book, more recent one, is called The New Pyramid Age. It came about after I had written an article about the Bosnian pyramids, that the publisher contacted me and asked whether I was willing to write a book about pyramids. And what I identified was that since 1994, our understanding of pyramids has completely changed. There have been radical discoveries in the field of archaeology which have completely changed the pyramid landscape. The oldest pyramids are in Peru. The tallest one, the largest one rather, if we exclude the Bosnian one, are in Central America, in Cholula in Mexico. So the entire pyramid landscape has changed, and obviously you have the likes of Robert Bauval and various other people who have been writing about pyramids in a new light as well. Some of my older books are Land of the Gods, which is about the mystery of Edinburgh, the region where I'm talking to you from now. The Stone Puzzle of Rosslyn Chapel, which is obviously about Rosslyn Chapel, and I specifically like that book for the reason being that it was actually written before the Da Vinci Code, and The Secret Vault, which is about part of the mystery of Rennes-le-Château. So those are currently my 5 titles in English.
So you've done some research at Rosslyn Chapel then, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
You know, I want to say last year, the year before, whenever it was that Ike came through, close to that time, I had, I think it was Rene Bartlett, I'm trying to remember his name. It's been a long time. He had a new movie out called Bloodline, and there were some caves that had been discovered not far from Rennes-le-Château that he had found a coffin in it. He was able to get a camera in there, but not, any people in there, that had a white blanket over it with a rosy cross on the middle of it. And they was able to get out some of the artifacts that turned out to be from about the middle of, about first century, or the first 100 years, the times of Jesus, in other words, and Mary Magdalene and them, from Jerusalem. And he saw that there were some scrolls or some books down in there, some information of some sort, but they haven't excavated it yet. I was wondering, do you have any knowledge about any of this?
Yes, first of all, Renee Barnett is a woman, and I ran into her actually 4 or 5 days ago in Rennes-le-Château, as she was organizing or running a tour there, and actually Tim Wallace-Murphy was with her. I'm not a fan of the Bloodline movie. It's largely based on a claim which was made about a decade ago and which was then rehashed. Bloodline as a production originally was going to run hand in hand with the Da Vinci Code and was going to do certain things, and then when that did not happen, the entire script went through about 3 different rewrites and in the end settled on this storyline. I have personally spoken to and have had other people speak to the official archaeological establishment in the south of France, that region, the Drac, and all of them have denied that there is an active file on this tomb. They say that they spoke once to Ben Hammett, which is not his real name, and that what happened was that Bruce Burgess, who was together with Rene Barnett, the producer of Bloodline, that Bruce Burgess and Ben Hammett came to their offices, showed them some footage which they had shot off inside the cave, and that they then asked what their opinion was. And basically, that is a quote chase. This is confronting people with something and then having them give a reaction, and that was then used to high acclaim and high publicity value by the Bloodline people, that they had official archaeologists interested in this. The official archaeologist in question said that after this one meeting, he never heard from them again. So the official archaeological establishment in France is waiting to see whether anything will come of this, and I don't think anything will. Tim Wallace-Murphy and I discussed this briefly on Saturday afternoon, and he actually apparently said to Ben Hammett, who was part of this tour before he had to leave on some emergency back to London, he told Ben Hammett that it was now time to show up or shut up, that he cannot continue making these claims without providing some sort of evidence and basically talking to the archaeological establishment of France. Right now, I am extremely skeptical, and until Hammett actually speaks to these French people and the French people begin to do excavations, I will remain skeptical, because basically at this moment in time, all of this has got the nasty and unpleasant smell of a big hoax.
I see. And that was Bruce Burgess and Renee Barnett I was trying to think of. They were both on my show. I looked it up while I was listening to you talk about all that. I know that Tim Murphy told me that Bruce Burgess had fallen into, bad company on that quite by accident. Or at least that was his idea, that it wasn't his intent. Also, that was Twilight of the Gods on that book on, Eric Von Daniken, his newest book. I had looked that up also. But, I think it's sad when we have things like this come up that could end up being a hoax because, you got people like you and Tim, Philip Gardner, Hugh Montgomery, and others that do a lot of work to try to bring this information forward, and then all the debunkers throw all the good work out and discredit this other stuff in doubt and just run with it and beat everybody to death with it.
Yes, and that's a bit the unfortunate aspect of the field of work we operate in. When you look at the art world, the vast majority of paintings are genuine. And we know that the art world on occasion is infested with a fake Leonardo, a fake Van Gogh, a fake this and a fake that. But nobody will go to the extent and say that all the art historians are charlatans, that there is no such thing as a Botticelli and that Leonardo da Vinci never existed. But unfortunately, that is the case in our field. As a guy like Ben Hammett and a few other people who make up these wild claims, and the subject of Rennes le Chateau is probably more infested with these people than any other area of alternative research. Basically, is used, as you say, as ammunition to debunk the entire thing, and that is unfortunate. But it is also the mindset of the 21st century, whereby people still want the world to be very boxed in. Where people are still unwilling to explore the mysteries of death, the mysteries of life, the mysteries of reincarnation, the question as to whether or not we were visited by alien beings in the past. And mankind in this regard comes into two categories: those who are extremely skeptical of all of these things and will use anything to either personally disbelieve or mount a crusade to disbelieve. And then the second category of people who are willing to explore this. And unfortunately, in that second category, there is a subcategory of people who will believe anything they hear. And that is as unfortunate as a skeptic, unfortunately.
But yeah, because you end up with disinfo agents that aren't even trying to be disinfo agents.
Yes, that it's the National Enquirer phenomenon. The same people who believe the National Enquirer will believe anything else.
And oddly enough, as much of a reputation as the National Enquirer has, there are still a ton of people that believe everything they read in it.
Yes, and I think it's that kind of technique is used by a lot of people like the Ben Hammets in this field as well. It's like first let's create a story about whoever, say Tom Cruise, and then let's put a spin on it in the next issue. And then in the issue afterwards, let's put another spin on this one, and it keeps people hanging. Like, oh, something will happen. We will follow this, and that is so unlike things in the real world, where news isn't portioned out on a weekly basis.
Well, I really like to see people like you, though. I noticed, like when I read the Metal Library story, that you had a lot of reluctance about accepting it. And I know there's people like Dennis Balthaser and, Stanton Freeman and others out there, that they're also very extremely skeptical of all this new material that comes out. And I think that people like that are doing a lot to make up all the bad that's been done, in other words.
Yes, in the case of the Metal Library, you have stories which are being circulated, and it's the telltale example I always think of is the case of the Crystal Skulls and Mitchell Hedges. It's a known fact almost that the official story as to how Anna Mitchell Hedges found the crystal skull is not true. It's a story which was being told at one point by her father, and it simply does not hold water. Now, skeptics and some people will therefore say, well, you see, this isn't true, so therefore the crystal skull is not real. And that is a conclusion which is first of all not scientific, but also doesn't really explain anything at all. So what I did there, with the help of a very good friend of mine, Chris Winter, who had known Anna for 2 decades at that moment in time, was to actually go beyond anything which had been written about on the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull. And the story which Chris specifically retraced was that as early as 1931, Mitchell Hedges had been writing about crystal skulls in fiction. He had written a book called The White Tiger, which, when you read it, is really applicable to himself. It's a guy who is English, who somehow ends up in Yucatan, and is identified by the locals as their future chief, some person from the outside who they are going to initiate. And as part of this initiation, they also are going to show him the treasure. And they bring him to an underground cave where walls are opened by a high priest. And as part of this trip down into the underworld and his exposure to caves, he sees gold, he sees various other things, including heads of crystal, i.e. crystal skulls. So in fiction here in 1931, we have a potential origin as to how Mitchell Hedges found his crystal skull. And I think it's stories like this and research like this which show that sometimes a lie is just a lie, but sometimes a lie also serves a different purpose, and that is that a person sometimes is unable or unwilling to explain how certain things pass into his possession. And I think in the case of the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, the story is definitely the latter. This person, couldn't explain how he got the crystal skull in his hands, and had to come up with a fake story, which then later was proven to be false, but that shouldn't, as so many skeptics do, just completely destroy his credibility. It simply means that he had a motive for lying.
Yeah, I knew there had been a big story on that, and there's another guy out with those dealing with crystal skulls, Joshua Shapiro. You probably know of him.
Yes, I do.
And I'm not sure. He's been on my show, and I've got no reason to believe or disbelieve him. But he doesn't really, at least that I can remember, mention, know anything about a story or a history or hearing, seeing anything about where they come from or their authenticity. But he does talk about the capability of the skulls, which I thought was very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Josh is a person who has worked with both ancient and modern skulls, and his focus is not necessarily on the historical context of crystal skulls, but basically what working with crystals as such, and crystal skulls in specific, can do to us, our body, and so much more.
Which, in all honesty, what a lot of people don't realize is quartz crystal is used in computers and God knows many other things, and they have many properties and many abilities that I'm pretty sure ancient people, back before the flood of Noah, for example, was probably well aware of it, because I'm one of those people that, after studying on ancient aliens and alternative history, has come to the conclusion that we more than likely had a lot different technology, a lot more advanced technology at one point in time than we do now, and I think some of it probably included crystal.
Yes, and again, to quote from Chris Winter, the other person who worked with Anna Mitchell Hedges, our planet is a giant crystal. There are places like Iona, which is a very sacred island just off the west coast of Scotland, where the crystalline structure of the Earth is just basically yards underneath the feet. There are very powerful places on Earth where we almost literally walk upon crystal. So, crystal is one of these unexplored minerals, if you want, which we really should explore more. And even though there's lots of practical applications for crystal, as you say, in watches and various other things, we really think that this is all just modern, that in the past nobody knew anything about these things, and that I think is a very reductionist point of view, or way of looking at history, which I think is bound to contain errors.
Which also, when people start saying that, oh, they were hunter-gatherers, they were cave people, they were not educated, they could not have known what we know now, then they trap themselves, because then they have to explain how they built the pyramids, how they built Baalbek, how they erected the statues at Easter Island, and, well, as you know, the statue of Colossus, and the list goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, there's something to be said for archaeology, but there's also something to be said for the fact that archaeology can never answer everything. I was, a few days ago in the south of France, and as anywhere in the world, you will see people who look like hippies, who have a long beard, who walk around in sandals, and who live in nature, and who will sometimes sit in a cave. Well, imagine a modern hippie like that dying tomorrow, and in 10,000 years from now we find his remains in the cave. While the rest of us who died in cities, some of us who might have been cremated, will never be found. So what does that say? What is the archaeologist in 10,000 years from now going to say? That we all live in caves? No, it just means that some people live in caves, and there are certain settings in which a human body will be preserved better than in other circumstances. So that is all archaeology will ever be able to answer, and it is why archaeology and history are two disciplines which should work hand in hand, but not sometimes too closely in hand, as is quite often the case at this moment in time.
Well, yeah, because you get too many Indians and not enough, too many chiefs and not enough Indians, and too many hands in the pot. Things can get pretty confusing.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times science is almost as bad as religion, about trying to fit the finds or the artifacts into the belief system and structure, rather than let them tell their own story, because if it doesn't match what the status quo that's already present, then it's got to be rearranged because it's not being properly understood somehow as the usual mentality.
Yes, and this works in weird and mysterious ways. A scientific process from a legal point of view is that if a piece of evidence, let's say a crime has been committed, a piece of evidence has to be taken as a whole. If an analysis of a bullet is done and the bullet is found out to be this and that, a lawyer is not allowed to kind of say, well, I'll accept the first bit of the evidence, but not the latter. It's the integrity of evidence is that you have to treat it as a whole. And I always think that's what science should do as well, and it's a proper scientific perspective. But one of the most telling examples, I think, is what we do with the Egyptian king list. There are several Egyptian king lists, and both the Turin papyrus, which is basically a papyrus which is in Turin, and Manetho, which is a 3rd century high priest of ancient Egypt, created these king lists. And these king lists are the backbone of us dating ancient Egypt. This is saying as to, like Khufu, who's identified as the builder of the Great Pyramids, lived in this period from this period. These king lists are accepted as factual. Well, these king lists also refer to gigantic pre-dynastic periods. There are, in these king lists, it says that before the first dynasty, there was a rule by the follower of Horus, which was sort of demigods. And before that, for a period of roughly 20,000 years, there was a rule of the gods themselves, that the gods of ancient Egypt literally walked on earth and ruled upon earth.
Yes.
And, the historians basically say, well, Manetho was right about everything to do with dynastic Egypt, but everything which happened before is, of course, legend and should be seen as mythical and should not be treated as fact. And that is so unscientific, and it is so, wrong and arrogant, because even if it were the case, then you need to come up with an argumentation as to why Manetho would have certain bits wrong and certain bits right. But this, oh well, we know it's mythical, is completely unscientific.
Where it seems like the method they're using now, what they're really doing is just picking and choosing what matches and what fits into the puzzle the way they want it to fit, the best way they can make it to fit.
Yes, and the certain bits of the Great Pyramid have been carbon dated. Those carbon datings results have shown that the Great Pyramid is about 300 to 500 years older than currently accepted. And a finding like that, that in itself is been put to one side by the likes of Hawass, because he knows that by dating the Great Pyramids to 500 years older, the entire Egyptian dating system basically falls apart like a house of cards. And so they desperately try to hang on to an outdated status quo, which is no longer factual, which hard scientific evidence has identified as being wrong, but let's just push it aside. And, we are just talking here about, well, when I say not very controversial, it's very controversial from an archaeological point of view, but not very controversial from the perspective that some people argue that the Great Pyramid is thousands of years older. But, the evidence is simply pushed aside. So what do you think is happening with datings or any other scientific conclusion which shows that certain things are not at all what they seem to be? There have been a very few amount of such findings to do with pyramids, not the Great Pyramid, but the second pyramid at Giza, whereby you just see that scientists say, oh well, the instruments must be wrong because this can't possibly be. And you kind of go, hold on, have you not tested your instruments? Because if you think they're working wrong, let's take them somewhere where you can probably find out whether or not your instruments are working wrong or properly. And once we have identified that, and if they are working properly, then come back and then let's do the test again. And if you still find that you have such gigantic anomalies in your reading, then they probably are anomalies.
Then you need to explain them instead of just sweeping under the rug.
Yes, and science, as you said, science is all about dogma these days. It's just as bad as religion, and it's unfortunate that we're in that position. But I also think it's a position which will have to be broken out of over the next decade, and I think that is going to happen because left, right, and center, the world of science is basically collapsing because there's too much trying to hold on to something which is now made out of thin air.
Now, before you get away from it, because I see we got 14 minutes remaining, somebody earlier mentioned that you had some knowledge on the Templars, and I wouldn't want to disappoint them and miss a chance to pick your brains a little bit about the Templars. Is there anything you can share with us about the Templars? Because they got a, big reputation. Some of my study has led me to believe that they were probably once Gnostics and maybe even the Cathars. But you might know a little more about that than I do.
Well, I think the Cathars and the Templars are, a very interesting subject. I think the Templars, to some extent, have been given too much credit on their own. So let me briefly explain that. The Templars are a very interesting organization, but I think, and this is something which I explain actually in my book, Servants of the Grail, I think the original story of how they were founded is actually somewhat in error. I don't think that the Templars found something underneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I actually think that the Templars were founded by the Aragon kings, and that actually the mythical story of how they were founded is a bit of like a smokescreen. You would really need to look at how the the arrogant kings created them and made them into something which, Wolfgang von Assenbach identified as servants of the Grail. Now, the Templars were a worldly power. They were there to control the world. They were there to work with finance. They created the check, and to a large extent, they are responsible for our world economy. So, we can all blame the financial crisis on the Templars.
They had the first credit card system, too, kind of like a traveler check system, didn't they?
Absolutely, and it was a great scheme. They said, like, hey, you're going to go to Jerusalem. How about if you give us all your money, and then when you come back in a few years, we'll give it all back? Well, as you know, some of these people on the Crusades never came back, so the Templars never had to give anything back. Right. But, as basic as that is, I think that the mystery of the Templars is really connected with the fact that what the Templars were doing was creating a unified Europe, 700 years before the most recent attempts to do so. They were there to make a central state which went above the existing national borders of that time. I think that is the mystery of the Templars as to why they were doing that. And I think the reason why they were doing that is because indeed they were trying to create a new nation, a nation which was based on different thinking, and a nation which had freedom of religion, which is why the link with the Cathars is so of interest and of importance. But it is a failed experiment. The Templars were disbanded in 1307. They were rounded up in 1307 and disbanded in 1312. And that is, unfortunately, I think, the end of the story. Stories about how Templars have survived and how they might have come to Scotland or how they have gone to America. I have never seen any genuine evidence for that. For example, stories about how there were ships in La Rochelle in France. That is definitely true, but what people always do not underline or do not know is that the convoy of, first of all, when the sacking of the Paris Temple happened, yes, various convoys left. Not all of them went into the direction of La Rochelle. There were convoys which went into other directions. Most of this material probably involved hard cash and currency, which, is probably of interest, but the world is not going to change if all of a sudden we're going to find some money which dates back to the 14th century. And the convoy which went into the direction of La Rochelle, it is known that it never arrived. It disappeared somewhere around the French town of Rouen. Whether it was confiscated or whether the Templars decided that they had to bury it in Rouen because they would never make it to La Rochelle, that is not known from a historical point of view. But, again, are the Templars a mysterious force? I do think so, yes, but they're also a very worldly force. They had a worldly mission, and their mission was to accomplish this. And I think the mystery of the Templars died with them. It was a failed experiment, and largely, unfortunately, I think, because the state they were trying to create was going to be something which that world had never seen, and maybe, the world of the 21st century should still see, because despite what we think, we still are a world which has very little religious freedom.
Yeah, this is true. I mean, not to, religious bash or anything, but in all honesty, in most places that it seems to me like anyway, around the globe, Christianity seems to be the mainstream religion, and the one that most everybody's being pushed into more than anything else.
Yes, I mean, of the organized religions, apart from Eastern and Middle Asia, it is the oldest one around. It's been around for 2,000 years. Even though, the Vatican, on occasion, undergoes certain things, they have been surviving for 2,000 years. They're good to get themselves around and, out of difficult situations. But, again, Christianity today receives far more benefits than anything else. George Bush gave a blanket signed a blanket declaration, basically, that any crimes committed by Ratzinger would, forever and in perpetuity be forgiven, that he would never have to face anything of a court in America. And, that is saying something. When you
That's
see
news
how...
to me, I was not aware of that. When did this happen?
Well, obviously during George Bush's presidency. I'm thinking it's 2005, but when you Google it, you will probably find it quite specifically. But these kind of things, as has just been kind of proven, are hardly unknown. But when it's are completely factual. But when you see how certain people want to build a mosque, a number of miles away from Ground Zero, there's all of this quite crappy kind of opposition to that, and a lot of spinning. And the world is measured by two weights, and I think politicians quite often say, oh well, there is freedom of religion, so that is it now, our task is done. Well, me and my partner Kathleen McGowan, we try to raise awareness about the fact that for the first time in history there is no slavery. Nowhere in the world does slavery exist. But for the first time, there are 27 million people living in slavery as we speak. There have never been so many people living in slavery as today. So a simple fact that politicians say, well, there's freedom of religion and there is no more slavery, doesn't make it happen.
Right. You could say that a car is red, but if it's actually blue, you're just talking. That's just empty words.
Yeah, and even if it's red, it might be a crap car.
Yeah. And what you told me, I'm going to look into that a little bit more because, like I say, that was news to me. But quite frankly, that's a scary thought if he did that.
He did an awful lot of scary things, Mr. Bush.
I mean, given the Vatican's history and the history of the popes and how they maintain their control and the terrorism that they use, that's like saying, well, come do it again.
Well, I mean, we all know that the Vatican is having some hard times. We know that, the current Pope and his brother have been identified as and linked with pedophilia from the word go. There has been tremendous uproar about Ratzinger's brother in Germany, in the diocese where he ruled, where there have been known cases of pedophilia, of people who have stepped forward. It shouldn't come as a surprise that a religion who says to men, suppress at all cost your sexual desires, that there is going to be some problems with that, because we have a human body, we have an innate sex drive, and when you are intellectually told that you can't do anything with that, unfortunately the weakest people in society, and in this case children, are going to end up being the victims of that. On so many levels.
No, that is definitely true. During the last 4 minutes there, Philip, I was just wondering about if you had some last-minute thoughts you'd like to share with the listeners.
I can keep talking for hours. So I think, what I always say is that I'm identified as a skeptic by the believers and a believer by the skeptic. And I try to occupy a middle ground. There is now clear evidence that something of us survives after death. It is clear that there is a point to be made for reincarnation. It is clear that ancient history, the way historians and archaeologists portray it, is not the final truth. And what I always hope is that I inspire people to kind of go beyond that and actually explore these boundaries, and in the meantime kind of provide them with some evidence that some of the things they believe in are actually true. Now, at the same time, I do not think we should blanketly endorse everything which is out there in the mind, body, and spirit section of bookshops or on television programs. I think we live in a scientific age whereby we are allowed to question, we are allowed to explore, and I think that is precisely what we should do. Life is a voyage of discovery, and we live to learn, and we learn to live. And I think that is precisely what all of us are here for, and what we are doing. And I think basically that this is something which everybody should embrace. And I will definitely commit the rest of my life into exploring the mysteries of the alternative, the paranormal, and history. And I hope that really me and the thousands of other people who do this will bring out this change in the world, which is that some of the things which people have always held to be true, like is there life after death, is there life in the universe, will actually be properly addressed and, if not answered by science in the next years, if not decades to come.
And I think if it was me, one of the things I would suggest to anybody is question everything. When you're exploring, question, like you were just saying. I'm with you on that one. Don't take anything at face value. I don't care what the source is. Millions of people can be wrong about the same thing.
Yes, absolutely. Truth isn't something of democracy. Truth, can be something which is held by one person, and we have definitely seen in the past that the truth was quite often held by a minority. So the truth, unfortunately, is not a democratic. It's not a democratic project.
And during the last minute, I want to thank everybody for coming and listening and participating in the show. Couldn't have a show without my listeners anymore, and I could have a show without the guests. And I want to thank you for coming, Philip. I know you took time out, and you were, it's 3 a.m. where you're at, and you're losing sleep, and I think you need to get to bed. But I want to thank you for coming and spending this time to share with my listeners, and hopefully maybe someday in the future you'd like to come back and share some more.
Absolutely. The pleasure has been all mine, and I always say that, we live in a 24-hour economy, and I also think that should apply to people. So whenever you want me at any moment of the day or night, I will be there.
Okay, no. Well, thanks a lot, Philip. I definitely appreciate that, and you take care of that earache. The Ancient Astronaut or Ancient Alien series that was mostly hosted by Giorgio Tsoukalos, which he's been on my show before, and he's coming back again in the near future in October to discuss Eric's newest book about extraterrestrials. And I'm having trouble pronouncing it. I don't have it in front of me, but it has to do with ancient aliens and the Return of the Gods in the Mayan calendar of 2012. I'm pretty sure you know the book I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. I do.
And I really should have had that in front of me, but I wasn't aware I was going to read that. And I got to tell you, I think you looked a little different on that show than you look in the picture I'm looking at now that I got from you online.
I need new photographs on my website. Is the short answer. My hair has been growing, yes.
Which would be why I may not have recognized you right away. But I got to tell you, ancient aliens, that's a favorite topic of mine. But one of the things that drew my interest to you more than anything else, it stuck out, this was like 2 years ago, was when I read that article on your site about the Metal Library. Because
2 years ago, Stan Hall died of cancer. So I knew Stan very late in life, and the legacy of the Taos Cave, and specifically trying to go to the place which Petronio had identified as a real Taos Cave, is now actually left to Stan's family, and specifically his eldest daughter has gone to Ecuador, to spend several years, if not the remainder of her life there, to dedicate her life and her time in trying to find out where the caves are. So, yes, since the time of me writing that article some years ago, the story could have progressed, but personal circumstances involving Stan's health basically mean that that hasn't happened.
So there's nothing really stopping anybody from going back to investigate it now, though, is there?
The only thing which is stopping people, some people have tried. Some people have gone there. To some extent, what you have to realize is that this is a treasure site. People knew what they were doing. So Petronio described it as such. Well, it's not like going into just any show cave, whether in America, South Africa, or wherever you want to go to one of these. This is a cave which was protected by people. And so what Petronio had to do to get in was actually dive in a river. He became interested. And in 1976, he organized an expedition using the Ecuadorian and the British armies and obviously governments to help him out into trying to find out where the supposed metal library was. And he went into what had been identified as the Tiles Cave. Now, it was a very interesting expedition. Scientists found so many new things, but from an archaeological or treasure point of view, nothing really was found. Stan stayed in Ecuador for up until the late 1990s. And in that period of time, he began to retrace how Moritz was telling the story. Where did he hear it from? Which were the people who might have known about this? And he identified one for one the main players of this saga. And he realized that the story actually originated with a person called Petronio Camarillo. And he realized that once he had contacted Petronio, then that we would be very close to discovering what it was. And then him and Petronio said that they should do an expedition to this cave. And unfortunately, when they were preparing this, Petronio was murdered in the streets in 1997, and so Stan was left to fence for it for himself. I knew Stan from roughly the early 21st century onwards, and unfortunately 2 years ago, in fact to this day, today.
I mean, that just smacked me as being very, very close, or, real close to the other Hall of Records that Edgar Cayce mentioned could be in the possible Yucatan. And I don't think the area you're talking about those are in is very far from that, is it?
Well, it to some extent is, because obviously the Yucatan is in Mexico and the Metal Library of Stan Hall is in Ecuador. So we're definitely still talking about several thousands of miles from each other. But when you're looking at like the contents of what Cayce was talking about, and the idea that certain knowledge is being held in caves for us, and that this is at some point for us there to discover, then yes, there is quite a bit of correspondence between the Edgar Cayce stories and the Metal Library.
Well, I got to tell you, you caught me red-handed. I'm not real good with geography.
You're Mr. Paranormal, you're not Mr. Geography.
There you go. But I got to tell you, it was still a very fascinating story, and I was wondering if you could, kind of brief my guests a little bit on what you know about that, because as far as I know from the time I read it, that could have been updated by now, couldn't it?
Well, what happened is this, that to give a very long story sometime, the Metal Library came about in the 1960s when a guy called Juan Moritz, who was a Hungarian expat, was staying in Ecuador, and he heard stories from the locals about the existence of this cave, the Cave of the Tiles, which was supposed to contain the Metal Library. And the Metal Library was said to be the long-lost treasure of a lost civilization, sometimes linked with King Atahualpa of the Incas, sometimes dating back even further. And he made contact with Eric von Däniken, who at that time had just published his book Chariots of the Gods. And so Eric came over, I think, in the early 1970s, and Moritz was a bit taken aback because Eric wanted to see for himself rather than just hear Moritz talk. And we now know that Moritz ran into a problem there, because Moritz was just reporting stories he had heard. He had never been inside. He didn't even really know where it was. So Moritz panicked and showed Eric von Däniken just a cave, anyone, and said that, oh, well, beyond this point, that's kind of like where the Metal Library is. Von Däniken wrote about it, and then because it was such a spectacular book, von Däniken was put to the test, and Moritz, under pressure, said that actually he hadn't shown von Däniken the Met Library. And the entire issue became extremely controversial. And Von Daniken to this day believes that all of the negative publicity involving it actually cracked some of his reputation. Now what happened from that point onwards is that a Scottish engineer of the name of Stan Hall